I would like to introduce to you President James Madison, who is visiting us from 200 years ago. Very special way that President Madison is able to come and visit us here at Auke Bay School. So if people that have questions, you may go ahead and start.
What was your life like as a kid and a child?
Well, good sir, that is a very good question, as many of you are children yourselves. What is your age range? May I guess about 12, 13? Was that too old? Much younger? 10, 11?
Yeah.
About that. Very good, very good. Well, I'm delighted to be here before you. Today is January 8th of 1814 in my day. So indeed, exactly 200 years ago to the day. I have been president for 2 terms now. I'm into my 2nd term. And things have been very difficult and very busy in my day with the War of 1812. I'm sure some of you have perhaps heard of the War of 1812, yes?
Yeah.
Well, indeed, a good question to begin with. I was born March 16th of 1751, and I was born to a farming family. I'm sure some of you perhaps are not born to farming families in your day, is that correct?
Yes.
I have not seen many agricultural endeavors here in this big, fantastical place, very cold, called Alaska, which did not exist in my day at all. I come from Virginia, and I'm the eldest of 12 siblings, but only 7 of us have lived to adulthood. I was named after my father, James Madison Sr. I am James Madison Jr. My mother's name is Nellie Conway Madison, and my siblings are William, Nellie, Sarah, Fanny, Ambrose, and Francis. And that is very flattering for me because that's 3 brothers and 3 sisters, not including myself. But when I was young, many of the enjoyments that I enjoyed particularly applied to the outdoors. Growing up at Montpelier on my farm, I had a very great opportunity to expand my horizons with learning, both in the farming industry, as my father is the owner of our plantation at Montpelier, and to enjoy just the spirits of the weather in Virginia. It's so very sunny and hot everywhere I go in Virginia. Not always, though. And riding horses was much of a pastime for me, but can I tell you all a secret? My favorite part of my childhood was books. I so very much enjoyed learning from books. My brothers would call me a bookworm, saying, "Jemmy Madison, you are always in the library." My father had a library of 80 volumes of books, and guess who had read every one of them when I was your age? You. Yes. I enjoyed many volumes of literature in my day. My favorite was a book called The Spectator by Joseph Addison and Richard Steele, which was published 100 years before I was born. But I enjoyed it very much. It talked of things about human nature, and animals, and agriculture, and geography, geometry, all kinds of just marvelous things that opened my mind to the world around me. And I also very much enjoyed school. I went off to boarding school when I was your age, 11. I went away from Montpelier for a time, for 5 years, and I enjoyed a very enjoyable time at Donald Robertson's boarding school and expanded my knowledge from the books that I had read at my father's library. So I had a very lovely childhood. Thank you for your question. Any other questions you have? Yes, sir.
Do you have any brothers or sisters? If so, what do they do for a living?
I do. I mentioned I have 3 brothers and 3 sisters. And actually, my brothers have all gotten married just years past, of course. They have children. My brother Francis is enjoying some time helping my father on the plantation at Montpelier. I am the eldest, but he is the 2nd eldest, so he takes over much of the plantation and farming industry as I am away at politics, doing what I'm doing as president. My brother Ambrose is happily married as well. He lives on his own plantation. All 3 of my sisters have gotten married. So much of what my siblings are doing is continuing on what my father had started for them as farmers and plantation owners themselves. But my career has been rather different. Yes, sir.
Did you go to college? If so, which one?
Very good question, good sir. I went to the College of New Jersey not long after I went to Donald Robertson's school from the ages of 11 to 16. I went back home to Montpelier for 2 years and studied under St. Thomas Martin. and he was an alumnus of the College of New Jersey, which is, I believe in your day now called Princeton. Are you familiar with Princeton in New Jersey? I had never ventured from out of Virginia before, but Thomas Martin had made such an impression on me at Montpelier as my tutor that he insisted that I go to his alma mater. So I packed my bags as the eldest son, and I went off on my first adventure. And I spent a 4-year degree in 2 years, which means that I was able to combine my first 2 years of schooling for 1 year, and then the second year for another 2 years. Now, I must encourage you to not do this, because it was very, very taxing on my own health. I became very, very sick, and so much so that when I graduated college, September of 1771, I was about 20 years old, 21, and I was so ill that I could not even attend my own graduation ceremony. So please do not tax yourselves at school, because as much as you may love learning, as I do, especially at a young age, it's very good to maintain a healthy balance in life. Yes, good sir.
When were you born and where?
I was born March 16th of 1751, and I was actually not born at Montpelier. I was born at Port Conway, Virginia, which was my mother's home. And only shortly thereafter, as the firstborn son, we moved back to my father's home at Montpelier. My father, James Madison Sr., was raised on the Montpelier plantation at Mount Pleasant. And he was also the eldest, the middle child of his family. He had 2 sisters, one older and one younger. And his father's name was Ambrose, my grandfather, Ambrose. But, interesting story about my grandfather. We believe and suspect that he was perhaps murdered. We believe he could have been poisoned by one of the slaves that we unfortunately owned at the time. I was not born yet, mind you. My father was 8 years old when his father passed from perhaps being poisoned. We know that it was quite an unfortunate event simply because of the fact that back then you had to be a man to own property. But the unique portion of that is the fact that my grandmother, her name was also Frances, because she was the mother of my father, of course. He was only 8 years old. He could not inherit my grandfather Ambrose's plantation. So what ended up happening, she ran the plantation. She ran Montpelier for those numbers of years, for 10 years, until my father turned 18 and took over the plantation himself. I hope that answers your question. Are there others? Yes, ma'am.
What did your father do for a living?
He was a farmer, young lady, and it was a very, very prosperous time. I would certainly say that if you go to Virginia in your day, you'll find marks of my family everywhere. You'll see the name Madison in just about every place around Shenandoah County, Culpeper County, and a little birdie has told me that there is a Madison County now, named after my family, right next to Orange County, where I am from, where Montpelier currently is bridled. My father was very well known in our county, in Orange County, and so much so, in fact, that by the time I had graduated from the College of New Jersey, I was, as I said, very sickly, very young. I didn't think I was going to live very long. So I decided to remain idle at home and continue to read. So for 3 years, from 1771 to 1774, I was what perhaps in your day would be called not very much of a do-gooder. I didn't know what to do with my life. In my day, I could either become a farmer like my father before me, I could become a merchant, I could become a lawyer, I could become a minister, or I could simply enjoy life as a simple farmer or doctor. It was primarily the profession that I could have chosen as the eldest child in my own realm. But I didn't want to do any of those things. So I simply continued to read, and my father said, "James, you need to get up and decide something. Do something." So at the time, in 1774, just 2 years, mind you, before our revolution. Many of you have studied the American Revolution, am I correct? I certainly hope so. Very important time. But tensions were running high politically for us as a nation. And I, as a young man, about 24, of my age at that time, my father said, "Come, let's join the Orange County militia." So I packed my bags with my father as a young man. He joined the militia as well, and we learned how to fight guns so that if the British ever came to America, we would be able to fight them. But I was not so good with these guns. I was terrified of them. And even though I was a good shot, whenever we did marches and parades around Orange County, It was so hot and I was so physically weak and small that I fainted on the parade grounds. Do not repeat, that is an embarrassing story in my own life. So, don't tell anyone. But I enjoyed it very much, learning to do something that was worthwhile for my country. And then, of course, 2 years later, my father and I witnessed the beginnings of our revolution. And we again entered back into politics with the Virginia Continental Congress and the Constitutional Convention of Virginia. And in 1776, while Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and Benjamin Franklin were writing the Declaration of Independence, I, as a young man of 26, was working with James Mason and Patrick Henry writing the Virginia Declaration of Rights. It's a very important document in my day because it was the first document in each of the states, mine from Virginia, where we wrote down every right that we could think of as the most important that were granted to human beings in our own context. That every human being is given inalienable rights, as you have heard. And my great achievement in that was I wrote the 15th clause, which stated the freedom of religion, the freedom of religious acts, and being able to practice your religion in any way that you see fit and choose. And that was the first time that had been stated in any government ever. And it was quite an achievement for myself as a very young politician. And that being said, that was my first entry as a young man of getting into politics. And I realized that if I'm going to continue to live, because I believed when I was young, during those idle years, that I was going to die very early. I was so very sickly that I thought, oh, what's the point? I have no life. I'm going to pass away at a young age. But no. And as you see me now. And it was very interesting you will find, I think, that you may think yourself one thing, that you want to do this for a career, that you want to carve a path. But in fact, you will find that the path will rather find you instead of you finding your path. Whatever you are passionate about, whatever you enjoy doing, whatever ways that you can serve each other as people, as a society, as a nation, you will find yourself fitting into your own niche or niche, as they say. So I would encourage you to not think too strongly or too negatively, in fact, about your own future, because each person has a specific part of the world and as a world changer in you. And that's one thing I had learned at that age, is I can enter into politics and I can help change the world. And that's what I ended up doing. From 1776 on through until 1780, I was a member of the Virginia legislature. And I worked very hard on Thomas Jefferson's Council of State. He was the governor of Virginia. And that's when he and I became very close as friends. I would consider Mr. Jefferson my best of friends. So I hope that answers your question. It is very long indeed. Yes, sir.
Do you have any children?
I do not have any children, no direct descendants. I am married, however. I got married to my wife, Dolly Madison, when I was 43 and she was 26. She had been married to a husband before that. His name was John Todd, and they were wed in Philadelphia, and they had two sons, Payne Todd and an infant son. But in 1793, a yellow fever epidemic swept through Philadelphia and killed not only John Todd, but also their second infant son. So Dolly was left as a widow, and she had no one to support her, no one to help her. She was assisting her mother, Mrs. Payne, at their boarding house. They were running a boarding house for a starching company. But that didn't leap off the ground, so Dolly only had herself and her firstborn son, Payne Todd. And I had just finished long sessions of the Constitutional Convention, and that's far further ahead in my own history than what I was just mentioning. But I had never been romantically inclined. But when I saw Dolly Madison walking past the State Building in Philadelphia, something inside me said, she's the one. I have to meet her somehow. So I contacted Aaron Burr, who was a senator from New York, who was actually staying at the same boarding house that Dolly's mother ran. So I contacted Aaron Burr, who was just in the building with me. I said, Mr. Burr, I hope you don't mind, but I would like very much if you would give me a formal introduction to Dolly Madison. Not Dolly Payne, she was not Madison yet. And he said, yes, of course. So I went to the boarding house, and I very nervously gave my introduction and my greeting to Dolly, and she would not say that it was love at first sight, but I certainly would say so. We enjoyed each other's company for the next year until I proposed to her. She had to go off somewhere in Virginia to visit a family member, and I went back to Montpelier, but I remember sitting at my desk at Montpelier as a 43-year-old, twiddling my thumbs. Will she say yes to my proposal? Will she say yes? And finally she did. I got that letter, and it was quite a wonderful, perhaps the most miraculous event in my life. That's not political, of course. So I suppose, in a short way of answering your question, I don't have any direct descendants, but because Dolly had her son Payne Ty, I chose to adopt him as my stepson. So yes and no. I do have a stepson, but I do not have any direct descendants. Yes, sir.
How did you and Thomas Jefferson become such good friends?
Very good question. I met him when he was first, actually, in 1776, just briefly when I was working on the Virginia Declaration of Rights. He actually gave me much encouragement in writing that 15th clause about freedom of religion. But I didn't really work closely with him until 2 years later, when he became governor of Virginia in 1778. And for those 2 years, 78 and 79, he and I worked very, very closely. I became, I suppose you could say, his right-hand man. He and I worked together for so many different things, and we found that we had many common interests. It's things like, I could go on and on and on, chess, the fact that we were farm owners and we enjoy agriculture and learning, and books. Both of us are bookworms, and we both enjoy French culture, French language. So I became very quick friends with Mr. Jefferson, even though he is 8 years older than myself. And one very big event that ended up occurring for us was while he was off in France for his diplomatic mission there in the 1780s, I had requested Mr. Jefferson to send books from Paris so that I could do research about the new ways in which we could change our government. I'm sure some of you have studied the Articles of Confederation, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
That had been our first mode, I suppose you could say, of government, the Articles of Confederation. And it was a very, very weak form of government. I like to compare it to a garment. If you take a garment, perhaps like the frock coat I'm wearing now, imagine this coat being torn and dirty and has holes in it. It has a form, but it's inadequate. It doesn't keep you warm. It's filthy. You can't fix it in any way. And what some people wanted to do with our government at the time was to take the Articles of Confederation, as broken as they were, and to put new patches of diplomatic meanings on them. But I'm sure some of you know that if you put a new patch on an old garment like that, it'll shrink. It doesn't work. So we knew what we had to do was to scrap the Articles of Confederation completely, going against our orders, by the way, in Continental Congress, and come up with a completely new form of government. Mr. Jefferson, from far off in France, was very much an encourager in this fashion. Many years after the Constitutional Convention, he had asked me to become a member of the Democratic Republican Party, which was the first political party that formed to combat the tensions that were happening in the government right after we were established in the 1790s. But then I became very fed up with government, and I retired for 4 years with Dolly. But it was Mr. Jefferson who pulled me back from the bootstraps and said, "Mr. Madison, I'm going to run to be the 3rd president after John Adams. Would you kindly consider becoming my Secretary of State? There is no other man that I would choose." I was reluctant at first. I had just turned 50, and my father had passed away in 1801. But I realized that there was no better way that I could serve my nation yet again, in a second round, I suppose you could say, than becoming Mr. Jefferson's right-hand man once again in the national government. So I became his Secretary of State from 1801 to 1809. We worked on the Louisiana Purchase. Have any of you heard of the Louisiana Purchase and Lewis and Clark? The expedition of Lewis and Clark going across to the west. It was a very, very fun time. I didn't go myself. I wish I had, though. And then following that, many of the difficulties with the Embargo Act of 1807, things that you can all research at a much later time in your own way. And then Mr. Jefferson requested that I become his successor as president in 1809. So really, if it wasn't for Mr. Jefferson and our very distinguished and very united career abilities, I probably wouldn't be who I am today. Yes, madam.
What is the name of your plantation, Hillary?
The name of my plantation is Montpelier. It is in Orange County, Virginia. I have mentioned it a little bit before, but it's I do enjoy talking about it. It's a beautiful place. You should visit sometime. We'll give you tea. Dolly will be there. Yes, sir.
Why did you want to be president of the United States?
Sir, I did not want to. The presidential office is one that one should run from rather than run toward. It is so incredibly difficult, and you must realize that the presidency is not fun and games. It is perhaps the most serious office that any person could ever hold. And as I mentioned just a few moments ago, Mr. Jefferson insisted that I succeed him as president. Otherwise, I would have turned tail and wanted to do something much different, perhaps something else in the legislature. I had been in the Virginia legislature for many years, and I had also been a member of the Continental Congress, and then before I was Secretary of State, I was a member of the House of Representatives in the first, second, and third, and fourth Congresses. So my work had always been behind the scenes. I had never been on the pedestal that Mr. Jefferson had. You must know that the presidency is an office that one should come into with humility, and one should not take anything lightly when you are making diplomatic decisions. The good thing about our government is the fact that we have established through our Constitution and, of course, our Bill of Rights, the system of checks and balances. And this doesn't make things easier, but it makes things much safer in a government such as ours. I hope that answers your question, sir. Oh, dear. How about you, sir?
Was the presidential race a close one for you, or did you win by a lot of votes?
I won by a lot of votes. You want to know how many?
Sure.
221 against Charles Pinckney's 47. Overwhelming. I was overwhelmed just by the numbers. Yes, ma'am.
Why did you think the government needed checks and balances?
Very good question. If you look at the systems of governments that have existed in time, if you look at the Roman Empire, all of the different Czechoslovakian governments of ancient and modern confederacies, you will find that there are links between each of these different empires, how they're structured. Some are more parliamentary, some are more monarchical, and you begin to realize that there are weaknesses and strengths in each of these governments. And one thing that we wanted to correct in our own nation is, since the Articles of Confederation were simply, I like to call it a peace treaty between all of the 13 sovereign states, or colonies as they were before the Constitution, we wanted to have a system that reflected the strengths of what a government could be and not a weakness in any form. So when I had requested Mr. Jefferson to send books from Paris, I wanted him to send me volumes in every language of every history that he could about these ancient and modern confederacies. What was the Spanish government like, the French government? And what I rather took upon myself to do was to research as much detail as I could at Montpelier. This was the winter of 1786 and the spring of 1787, just before the Constitutional Convention. And I gathered all of this information, and I went through everything bit by bit. And I've created what ended up becoming the Virginia Plan. Have you read about the Virginia Plan at all? It was essentially, we announced it on May 27th of 1787 at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. I wouldn't give credit completely to myself, but I had come with my Virginia Plan to the convention. And I insisted that Governor Edmund Randolph from Virginia present it, because I didn't have as good of a speaking voice at that time. I still don't. And I wanted someone who was in more authority than I to present it, so it would have better favorable status with the 55 delegates that were there at the convention. And the good thing is it passed. And the Virginia Plan, essentially, from my research, consisted of a bicameral legislature, the Senate and the House. I'm sure some of you have learned about that. And then the 3 branches of government. Can anyone tell me what the 3 branches of government are?
Republicans, Democrats.
Oh, no. But you're on the right track. We have essentially the legislature, which is the legislative branch. And we've got the judicial branch, which has the court of law, the Supreme Court. Haven't you heard of the Supreme Court at all?
Yes.
And then we've got the executive, which is the president, and that is the position that I sit in now. I hope that answers your question. Yes, sir.
When Thomas Jefferson was president, how did you help him?
Yes, very much so. In fact, we were hand in hand, especially with the Louisiana Purchase and the Embargo Act of 1807. I could go into detail about all of those things, but I want to spare you the time to answer questions. Yes, ma'am.
Why didn't the issue of slavery become part of the Constitutional Convention?
It actually did. We had to negotiate, to put it very simply, if you've read about the 3/5 clause, or the Great Compromise that occurred in the Constitutional Convention, the heart of that is essentially, perhaps, I would say for about 4 weeks in the Constitutional Convention, the biggest issue was representation throughout the legislature. What would the House of Representatives look like? What would the Senate look like? Would there be population representation, or would there be equal representation? Now, we knew we wanted both of them. We didn't know how it would be structured, how would it be numbered. So we realized that this was really more of a debate between the northern states and the southern states, but also the larger states and the smaller states. And of course, those 13 states, all of them had different fluctuations of both of these. Northern states had no slaves. It was primarily a white population. The southern states had slaves, of course. Still do in my day, in fact, in 1814. And then, of course, you have small states like Connecticut versus large states like Virginia. So people were concerned about, will the slaves be counted? If they're counted, then the large states and the southern states are going to have all the power. But then people said, well, what about the northern states? They have all white people, so they'll count more legitimately. What about the small states? Will they have equal representation? So a lot of the debate was focused on this, and we realized that the Great Compromise, which ended up becoming primarily a solid rock in our negotiations in those 4 weeks that we needed, was to have the 4/5 clause for slaves to balance out the population of the northern states and the southern states. I didn't prefer it that way, but it was the only way we could compromise all of the tensions and passions that were rising in the gentlemen in that room in Independence Hall in Philadelphia. It was a very hot room. I would not advise it. Open the windows. We could not open the windows, in fact, because we were doing something against our orders by writing the Constitution, as I mentioned before. We were only assigned by the Continental Congress to revise the Articles of Confederation. We could not have written the Constitution without it being absolutely in secrecy, to our benefit, in fact. Any more questions? Yes, ma'am.
How did the War of 1812 start, and can you explain it, please?
That is quite a question. I will say the conflicts of the War of 1812 really began as far back as my earliest terms in the Secretary of State, as President Jefferson's Secretary of State. To put it very simply for you, this is very, very complicated, the War of 1812 and how it began and such. But essentially it began when French and English sailors on the high seas were stealing our American sailors from their merchant ships going to and from the Americas to Europe. It took 6 weeks to go from America to England or France. And if you're familiar, by 1789, the French Revolution began. And Napoleon began to flood his way up through France to Europe and England and Russia. You're familiar. And one thing he was very, very good at was conquering every people he could. But he also wanted to conquer us Americans and take advantage of the fact that we were at peace with ourselves and we had negotiated a peace treaty and neutral negotiations on the high seas with them. But they were under no circumstances wanting to respect that. So they took advantage of taking extra sailors, extra soldiers from America to fight in their own war. They forced the English and the French, because they were at war with each other, used our own people to add to their number so they could fight each other. Now this, of course, is unacceptable. You can't have that at all. But this went on for years until finally we had to, the Embargo Act of 1807, as I mentioned, soon after the Louisiana Purchase, was essentially Mr. Jefferson and my first real serious attempt to stop this from happening. So an embargo is when someone completely cuts off any communication, any negotiation, any trade with European nations. But in fact, America was so strong in our economy that this embargo act hurt us more than it hurt the Europeans. We weren't able to ship out corn and tobacco and every week things that we were trying to get rid of and get money for, and our main buyers were of course the French and the British. So we had hoped that cutting them off would hurt them, but in fact it hurt us. So much of what ended up happening after that, beginning with our presidency, ended up having to lift the embargo act and try to continue trade with them, but at that point our relations had been so very damaged that I tried to put pieces back together, but it was unsuccessful, to put it very, very simply. And our last resource was to declare war. We had wondered whether to declare war on England or France, but because of England's poor history with us, I decided it was best to go declare war against England, simply because their grievances with us were so much more severe than the French. And I like French, so hope that answered your question. Yes, sir, in the back.
What happened during the Constitutional Convention in 1786?
1787.
No, it was 6.
It's all right. You could say it began in 86. But essentially what happened, good sir, is that was the time in our period in history when we needed to write something completely new to start a new form of government when we had declared independence with Great Britain. I've mentioned a lot of it before, but just to recap just briefly, the Constitutional Convention was essential simply because no government had been written in that way ever before, with a bicameral legislature, 3 branches, a system of checks and balances, and again, that knowledge of that structure, that skeleton of what ended up fleshing out to be the Constitution came from the studies that I had endeavored in 1786, winter of 86, spring of 87. So many people have called me the father of the Constitution. I'm very flattered by this, but I must say, sir, that the Constitution was the work of many heads and many hands, and not a single brain. So it was quite an endeavor, and I find that it's important for you to know about how your government was structured. So please continue research as you learn. Yes, sir. Yes.
What was the first job you had in politics?
First job? Paid?
I don't know.
You don't know? Well, the first official political position that I would say is, I mentioned the Virginia Continental Congress. That was my first official paid job. That was after I had met Mr. Jefferson. The first that I had ever actually entered into was in 1776, when I was a member of the committee that was writing the Virginia Declaration of Rights with George Mason. It was a very, very good time for me as a young gentleman. Yes, ma'am.
What was the Great Compromise?
I mentioned just before, the Great Compromise was essentially a compromise that suggested that the 3/5 clause be written to balance out the populations of the slaves versus the white population. That was the heart of it. There are many more articles in the Great Compromise, but that's the one at this age that you should really know. Yes, ma'am.
What made you become interested in helping our country figure out a form of government?
Well, I would say the single answer to that is the fact that help was needed. Help was needed, a mind was needed, an intellect was needed, and a bookworm was needed. So I committed myself to serving my nation. I have been on that journey for almost 40 years now. I have enjoyed it, but it has been very difficult and very stressful. So know for a fact if you're going to be in politics, commit to it. Yes, ma'am.
Was it hard to get the delegates in Philadelphia to agree with you on your plan to set up the government?
Oh yes, very difficult, very difficult. In fact, so difficult that there were 3 members at the end of the delegation that didn't even sign. Elbridge Gerry and a couple of other, Edmund Randolph, in fact, the governor who had presented the Virginia plan. He did not sign the constitutional document that he had written either. So not everyone ended up agreeing. Only 37 of us total ended up actually signing. Some people left. Actually, Alexander Hamilton left for a time and then came back. We were like, where were you? So things get difficult. Yes, sir.
How did you get the nickname Father of the Constitution?
Mainly because of the fact that I had written the Virginia Plan, which was the structure of our government. I had mentioned that just a little bit ago. Yes, sir. Oh, ma'am, sorry.
Why did some of the states not agree with your idea of government?
Some states didn't agree simply because you must understand that there are a lot of factors that go into political negotiation, primarily because there are interest groups. Some people want something specific, some people want a general, broader sense of any kind of agreement. So imagine yourself having a debate with your class. You all wouldn't agree on everything you debate about, or that you talk about. Say you bring up who likes cats and dogs better. Already you'll have some people liking cats and some people liking dogs better. It's simply human nature. People do not always agree. So compromises are always essential to balancing out the interests of everyone involved. Yes, sir.
Are you a popular president?
I hope so. If I got that many votes, I certainly hope so. But I would flatter myself to say yay or nay. Any other questions at all? Yes, ma'am.
Can you explain why the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution?
Very good question. I'm glad you asked. Something I haven't just covered yet. Well, essentially, the Bill of Rights started really with the Virginia Declaration of Rights. Each of the states had written documents of their own that listed, okay, these are all the rights that human beings are supposed to have for a government. But one of the great arguments during the Constitutional Convention was we should have a national document of rights. Well, most people put it down, including myself. And here are my essential reasons why initially I put the idea of the Bill of Rights down. Number one, we had already had those state conventions with their declarations of rights. We didn't need a national government to do that. Two, can any of you take a piece of paper and write down every single right that is given to you as a human being?
No.
There are hundreds of rights that God and society and humanity in general give to us. We can't have one document trying to protect that. And three, what's one piece of paper like these going to do to protect someone from getting their religion smashed or someone from getting violated in any way? One piece of paper would have a very difficult time protecting you in that way. So what would be the point? In my own original estimation, it was a worthless endeavor. But when the Constitution was finally ratified by the states and it was sent off to the states for official ratification in each of the states, after I had written the Federalist Papers with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay in New York, I went to Virginia and I fought for the Constitution against Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry was very eminent in saying, we must have a Bill of Rights, we must have a National Bill of Rights, I don't care what your arguments are, we're going to have a Bill of Rights. And he was a very emotional gentleman. He was always very extravagant in his delivery, and I was very much, well, I think this is the best way to do it. And so the differences in our passions were quite opposite. But it ended up becoming so that I essentially agreed in my own personal act to say, all right, Patrick Henry, George Mason, I will agree, as I did for 1776, for the Declaration of Rights, I will agree to take the state constitutions and their rights and combine them all into one document that will essentially become a National Bill of Rights. Not because I agree with it, but because I just want the Constitution ratified. I just want it to come to pass. And if this is a safety net for you, I will agree to help with that. So the Constitution was ratified with that agreement in mind, for Virginia, of course. And there were different arguments and things that went on with politicians outside of Virginia, of course. But essentially, after I was a member of the first Congress, and the first act that I did was in 1789, and then of course later on in 1791 when the Bill of Rights was finally ratified, I agreed to create the Bill of Rights, the document of what you now know as the Bill of Rights. It went between the Senate and the different states and back through the House and the House of Representatives. On June 8th, I had actually announced it that year in 89. And then finally it was ratified, and much to my satisfaction, most of the anti-federalists who had been promoting the idea of the Bill of Rights agreed with it. And that's why I'm not only called the father of the Constitution, but I'm also called the author of the Bill of Rights. Hope that answers your question. I do like talking about the Bill of Rights. It's one of my favorite topics to discuss, simply because it's probably one of the most important things that I ended up achieving. Even though I had, like I mentioned before, hadn't planned on it. Yes, sir.
What accomplishment made you the proudest?
I would say it's the Bill of Rights, actually. But my greatest personal achievement, I would say, is my marriage to Dolly Madison. She is such a light to my life, and I hadn't thought that I would get married, but I must say it is most pleasurable to enjoy the company of another person. Are there other questions? Or are we out of time? Oh, we have 10 minutes left. Yes, ma'am.
What is your wife like?
My wife, she's my complete opposite, if you can imagine. I am rather quiet sometimes. I can be not very social. But my wife, if she were to come in here, I should have invited her to come. If she were to come into this room, imagine a woman wearing red velvet from head to toe, and a turban on the top of her head, and curly black hair coming from the sides, dark eyebrows, nice oval, beautiful face with pink cheeks, bright blue eyes. She would come right up to you and engage you in conversation, enjoy talking about you, what your life is like. She lights up the room whenever she comes in. She is a star, a princess, as she likes to say. And many people actually in our government are saying that she is the first lady, because she is the first woman to ever take any kind of political and social responsibilities for her own relationship with not only myself as president, but for everyone. When Jefferson was president, he was a widower at the time. And I was invited, of course, as I mentioned, to be Secretary of State. And Dolly, my wife, decided to take on the social responsibility for Mr. Jefferson to entertain and to serve teas and cakes for the politicians and people in Washington City, which is now Washington, D.C. That's right. And it was quite a time. She really defined her own role socially in the government. So you would find my wife, I find, to be much more interesting than myself in engaging in conversation. I enjoy talking of politics, but my wife could talk about anything. Are there any other questions at all? Oh, I do want to tell you about our parrot. Our parrot, Polly. Seriously. Polly. She's now since passed, but we had a parrot, a green parrot, in the White House during my term as Secretary of State. And, funny story, Dolly acquired this parrot from a merchant seller in Philadelphia. I believe it's either Philadelphia or Washington City. I can't really remember at the moment. But this parrot will swear in French. You walk into a room, this parrot, I'm not even going to repeat. I know the French words that are bad, but I will not say them. This parrot, she will screech and scream these words, and only Dolly can make the bird be quiet. Only her. And one interesting story that I do not like to repeat because it haunts me even now is one time I went back to my home at Montpelier during a break during my presidency, just last year, a couple of years ago. And Dolly took this bird with her back to Montpelier, and my nieces, my little niece Mary Willis, was running around my home at Montpelier, which has now been expanded, in fact. And my niece, who was only 5 years old, went up to the bird and waved at the bird. And Polly started freaking out. She started flying around the room, chasing my little niece around, and she was saying, "Mr. Madison, James, come quickly!" So I had to run upstairs and interfere between the bird and my niece, and I had to grab the bird, and Polly, the stupid animal, bent her beak over and bit me on the finger right here to the bone. It was painful, drew blood, very, very serious, to the bone, and Dolly had to grab the bird and say, "Don't you do that to Jemmy anymore." And from that day on, I swore to Dolly, I said, "Dolly, I want there to be a hawk to come around Montpelier and to eat that parrot." Not long after that, it happened. I'm very pleased to say so. But don't tell Dolly that. She was very, very sad. But I'm very, very happy. So, interesting story there for you. Are there any other questions at all? Yes, ma'am.
How did you meet your wife?
I met her in Philadelphia, and what a wonderful time it was. I did tell the story just a little bit earlier, but just to mention again, Dolly and I had never met before when we had seen each other in Philadelphia. But Aaron Burr was so very generous in having us meet together that it took a while for Dolly to really realize that I was the man for her. She had just been a widower for about a year at that point. She was still very sad for the grievance of losing her first husband. But I was able to warm up to her and she to me, and now we are happily married. Are there other questions at all? No? Very good. Well, thank you all very much. I enjoyed speaking with you today.